In August 2020, his yacht was found drifting near the Faroe Passage. He was rescued 2 days later, barefoot and repeating coordinates that led nowhere. He had sailed through worse, storms that ripped sails into ribbons, nights when the compass spun with no reason. Even that one time the hull groaned so loudly in the Arctic ice he thought it would split in half. But this was different. The sea hadn't roared, it had gone quiet. He was 4 days into a solo passage across the North Atlantic, somewhere west of the Faroe Islands. The weather forecast had been clear: light wind, scattered clouds, low swell. He had planned the trip carefully, checking pressure maps, wind shifts, satellite currents. Everything had aligned. He trusted the numbers. The ocean, however, had its own plans. It started with the fog. It didn't roll in like a normal front. It rose, suddenly and silently, like a curtain being pulled across the world. One moment the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction. The next, the world ended 10 feet from the deck. Visibility dropped so fast he didn't have time to mark a bearing. The compass held steady, but the GPS began to jump. Just small skips at first, then full positional drops. The signal would vanish for a few seconds, then return with impossible data. One coordinate placed him inland, in Norway. Another, mid-air over the Atlantic Trench. He laughed it off at first. Glitches happen. Maybe the fog was denser than it looked. Maybe there was interference. Still, he reduced speed and turned the auto helm to manual. If this was a temporary anomaly, he'd ride it out. But time moved strangely in the fog. He couldn't tell if he'd been drifting for 20 minutes or 2 hours. The light overhead was flat and gray, with no direction, no shadows, no movement. The wind had completely vanished, leaving the sails slack. Even the ocean itself had stopped speaking. There were no waves, no crests, just a vast, breathing stillness. He checked his radio. Dead air. Not static. Silence. He turned it on and on again. Nothing changed. His emergency beacon didn't flash. All systems were running, but none were connected. And then came the voice. Not over the radio, not from below deck, from somewhere just behind the mist, too faint to understand, too human to ignore. He turned quickly, scanning the water, but there was nothing, just fog, just stillness. He spoke out loud, asking if someone needed help. There was no response. He sat down on the deck, telling himself he was just tired. He hadn't eaten since morning. Maybe the disorientation was just low blood sugar. But when he leaned back against the mast, eyes closed, he felt something shift beneath him. A current, a push, as if the boat had been grabbed, then gently redirected. He opened his eyes. Through the thinning fog, a shape appeared, a dark outline, angular, rising from the sea. He stood slowly, squinting into the haze. It was a lighthouse, and it was far too close. He hadn't seen any landmass on the charts for over 100 miles. There were no islands in this sector, no recorded beacons, no reason for a lighthouse to exist out here. But it was there, solid, unmoving, casting a dim, steady light through the thickening air. He tried to turn the helm, but the yacht didn't respond. The wind was still absent. The water had gone completely flat. He reached for the motor, but before he could start it, the fog collapsed again, thicker this time, swallowing both sea and sky. Everything went black. When he woke, he was lying in shallow water, the yacht nowhere in sight.
and ahead of him, the lighthouse stood quietly on the shore of a nameless island, still lit, still turning. His clothes were soaked and heavy, clinging to his body like wet rope. He pushed himself up from the shallows, hands sinking slightly into the cold sand. The tide lapped around his legs, slow and indifferent, as if it had delivered him and now had no further interest. He turned to look behind him. No yacht, no sail, no trace of how he had arrived. Only fog. It clung to the water's surface like a blanket that refused to lift. He tried to recall the last clear memory he had on the boat, the compass jumping, the light appearing through the mist. Then nothing. No impact, no storm, just the sudden transition from drifting offshore to waking up on this strange coastline. The lighthouse stood just beyond the beach, perched on a slope of jagged black stone. It was tall, narrow, and unnaturally still, its glass lantern room rotating in perfect silence. A soft white beam swept through the fog at steady intervals. The structure looked old but well kept. There were no visible cracks or signs of decay. The metal balcony that ringed the top shimmered faintly in the overcast light. He had never seen this lighthouse before, not in person, not on any map, and he had studied maps obsessively before setting sail. He rose to his feet, shaking the water from his arms. The air was colder now, the kind of cold that came not just from temperature, but from isolation. No birds, no wind, no movement beyond the lighthouse's gentle turning. He checked his pockets. His waterproof watch was gone. So was the GPS unit he always kept clipped to his belt. Only his emergency whistle remained, hanging silently from his jacket zipper. He didn't blow it. The beach led to a narrow path, carved unnaturally clean through stone and moss, as if someone or something had cleared it recently. He followed it slowly, each step crunching against damp gravel. As he walked, he noticed small signs of habitation, wooden posts, a rope handrail, even a rusted buoy leaning against a rock. All worn, all faded, but not ancient. This place had been used. He reached the base of the lighthouse. The stone platform beneath it was smooth and cold, with patches of wet lichen near the foundation. The door stood shut, not locked, not barricaded, just closed. A brass plate above the frame read only one word, Hallward. It meant nothing to him. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to walk away, to call out for help, to find another path inland, maybe a signal, maybe something rational. But there was nowhere else to go. No signs of life beyond this tower. And the longer he stood near it, the more he felt drawn to it, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. He reached for the door and pulled it open. The hinges groaned softly, but the door moved without resistance. Inside, it was warm. Too warm for a structure exposed to this kind of wind and moisture. The scent hit him next, old wood, kerosene, and something else he couldn't place. Not foul, but unfamiliar. A small lamp burned at the bottom of the spiral staircase, steady and bright. On a nearby table sat a tin cup, still half full with liquid. It was warm to the touch. Someone had just been here. But the room was empty, and the only sound was the slow rhythm of the lantern above, turning through fog that refused to lift. He climbed the narrow staircase, hand trailing along the curved iron rail. Each step echoed softly, the kind of echo that came not from emptiness, but from something deeper, like the space itself had grown used to solitude and didn't appreciate the intrusion. The air grew warmer the higher he climbed, as if heat rose unnaturally through the tower. The scent of oil and damp stone lingered around him. The staircase ended at a small landing with a wooden door slightly ajar. He pushed it open with care, half expecting it to creak, but it moved silently. The room beyond was surprisingly well kept. A small desk sat near the window, stacked with yellowed papers and a rusted compass. Along the opposite wall stood a narrow bed with a wool blanket folded tight at the edges. A coat hung neatly on a hook. A lantern rested on the windowsill, still glowing faintly. It was a living space, functional, sparse, but lived in. He moved slowly, examining the items without touching them. The papers on the desk weren't just random notes. They were logs, handwritten entries, dated in a format he didn't recognize. The handwriting was tight and disciplined, looping carefully in faded black ink. Some pages had weather data, wind speed, visibility, sea conditions. Others were less clear. One line simply read, "Light turned without order, must note repetition." He scanned more pages. Voices in the fog again, 4 intervals this time. Dreamt of the room before I built it. They always arrive barefoot. He paused. Something about that last sentence felt uncomfortably precise. He looked down at his feet. He hadn't even realized his shoes were gone. He was barefoot. When had that happened? He stepped back instinctively, heart pounding. There had been no moment when he'd removed them, no memory of kicking them off. But here he was, feet pressed to the cold wood floor, and the logs, decades old by the look of them, already new. He turned toward the bed, trying to refocus, trying to hold on to logic. That's when he noticed the photo. It sat in a small wooden frame beside the lantern, a black and white image, faded at the edges. It showed the lighthouse, unmistakably the same structure, but the figure standing outside the door, facing the camera, was wearing a jacket almost identical to his, and the face, though blurred by time and grain, was too familiar.
It looked like him. Same build, same posture, same eyes. He stared at the photo, frozen, searching for an explanation. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was someone who had once looked like him. But he couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't a mistake. This room, this tower, it had been waiting. It knew him. It had always known. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows. The beam of the lantern above swept across the landscape in perfect rhythm, as if nothing strange had ever happened. But down below, the radio crackled. Not once, not by accident. A clear, deliberate burst of static, followed by a single phrase, "Come back upstairs." He froze at the sound of the voice. It hadn't been loud. In fact, it had barely risen above the soft crackle of static. But it had spoken clearly, with tone and weight, as if whoever was behind it wasn't just broadcasting a message, but delivering a command. He looked toward the stairwell, heart pounding, waiting to hear it again. The silence that followed was absolute. No repeat transmission, no second voice, just the soft hum of the lantern and the low buzz that now filled the room, seeping into the corners like a slow mist. He moved down the narrow staircase, unsure if he was obeying the voice or simply trying to prove it hadn't been real. His bare feet touched the cold steps with a quiet rhythm. With each turn of the spiral, he noticed something strange. The walls had changed.
When he'd first climbed up, the stones were uniform, rough, pale gray, and covered in decades of soot. Now, small markings had begun to appear. Not graffiti, not weathering. Etched lines, circles, symbols. They looked old, but they hadn't been there earlier. At the base of the tower, he stepped into the main room and turned to the far corner. The radio sat on a steel table, large, weathered, and industrial. The kind of equipment used in remote outposts. No lights glowed on the panel. No dials moved. It looked completely dead. But the static was still there, soft, steady. He reached for the dial and turned it slowly. The resistance felt strange. It wasn't mechanical, not exactly. More like turning something that didn't want to move. He found a frequency with less static and waited. At first, there was nothing, just air. But then he caught fragments, not words,
Not language, more like memory leaking through sound. He heard footsteps, a page turning, breathing. Then, faintly, his own voice. It wasn't live. It was a recording. He didn't remember ever speaking those words, but they were his. The cadence, the tone, the small hesitation in his breath. He was talking about the fog, about a light in the distance, about waking up on a shore he didn't recognize. It was his voice, but from before he had entered the lighthouse. He pulled his hand away from the radio as if it had burned him. This couldn't be possible. There was no transmitter strong enough to record and play back something that hadn't happened yet. Unless it had happened before. Unless he wasn't the first person to drift here. And maybe he hadn't come here at all. Not in the way he thought. He turned and looked at the walls again. More symbols. One of them repeated over and over. A spiral drawn tightly inward, as if folding time into itself. He opened a drawer beside the radio. Inside, he found a stack of logbooks, more recent than the ones upstairs. The entries were shorter, messier, less controlled. The voice knows my name now. Days repeating. Fog never lifts. Signal looped, still transmitting. I saw him again. This time, he saw me too. He flipped to the final page. A single sentence had been written in bold strokes. The light never goes out. The room felt suddenly colder. He looked toward the window where the beam of the lantern swept across the fog. It hadn't faltered, not once, not since he arrived. And somehow, that constancy felt less comforting now, like the tower wasn't lighting the sea for others, but holding him here. He turned back to the radio. The static had returned, but now, beneath it, there was breathing. And this time, it wasn't his. He stopped keeping track of time. At first, he had tried, marking each hour by the sweep of the beam overhead, watching the lantern rotate like a pendulum that never missed a beat. But after the third cycle, he began to notice the intervals weren't consistent. Sometimes the light moved faster, sometimes slower. Once it paused completely, then resumed without warning. It was impossible. Mechanically, it should have been stable. And yet, it wasn't. He searched the tower from top to bottom. There was no generator, no power source. No sound of gears or motor, nothing to explain how the beacon was still functioning. The bulb was old-fashioned, filament-based, and yet it glowed steadily, without flicker or heat. It simply stayed on. He ate what little rations he found in the pantry, though they were unlabeled and unfamiliar. The bread was hard. The water tasted like copper. He slept in short intervals, never fully resting, never truly awake. In his dreams, he stood inside the lantern room, watching the ocean move in reverse.
Waves rolled backward, stars blinked out of order, and the light never turned off. On the third day, or maybe the fifth, he climbed to the top of the tower again. The glass chamber was clean, too clean. No dust, no cobwebs, not even moisture. He walked the full circle along the narrow walkway, staring out into the fog. But this time, something was different. He could see another light, far in the distance, barely visible. It blinked once, then again, then disappeared. He stared at the spot, heart racing. Was it another lighthouse? A signal? A ship? It hadn't followed any known pattern, just two flashes, then silence. He waited. Nothing returned. Later, he found himself sitting in the keeper's room again, thumbing through the logbooks. One entry stood out, not because of what it said, but because the handwriting matched his own perfectly, line for line, letter by letter. The light is not warning them, it's holding me here. He dropped the book. This wasn't a lighthouse anymore. It was a loop, a mechanism that didn't just emit light, it remembered. It pulled people in. It showed them fragments of lives they hadn't lived yet, or maybe had lived already and forgotten. The deeper he looked, the more he felt like he'd been here before. Not once, many times, maybe always. He returned to the radio. It was quiet now. No static, no voices, just a soft hum, like breath beneath the surface. He touched the dial, and it responded, not mechanically, but almost like it was waiting for him. A single voice came through, clear, calm. When the light goes out, you'll be free. He leaned back, staring at the lantern above. It hadn't gone out since he arrived. It hadn't even dimmed. He knew now what he had to do. He climbed the stairs one last time, step by step, until he reached the lantern room. The beam moved slowly around him, sweeping across the fog-covered sea. He approached the central column, reached out, and placed his hand on the base of the light. It was cold, colder than metal should be. And beneath his palm, he felt something pulsing, not mechanical, but alive. He hesitated. If he broke it, what would happen? Would he escape, or would the tower reset, bring him back, start again? He looked out the window one final time. The fog parted, just slightly, and far across the sea, he saw his yacht, drifting, waiting. He took a breath and shut off the light. When the light finally went dark, it didn't flicker or fade. It simply ceased. 1 second it was turning above him, casting its rhythmic beam through the mist. The next, it was gone. Not extinguished, not broken, just absent. He stood in the lantern room, staring into a hollow space where that presence used to live. The air felt lighter now, not safer, not warmer, but freed of pressure, as though the building had been holding its breath for years and was only now allowed to exhale. The silence was thick, but not hostile. No more hidden footsteps, no voice whispering from the static, just the sound of his own breath and the soft creak of the tower returning to stillness. He made his way down the spiral stairs slowly, touching the rail not for support, but almost as a farewell. Every corner he had once feared to explore now felt dull, stripped of tension. The markings on the wall, which once seemed to pulse or shimmer in his peripheral vision, had grown cold and inert. The scent of oil and stone had faded. Even the hum from the radio, constant and low since his arrival, was gone. When he stepped outside, the transformation was complete. The fog had lifted. The island, which had felt like a prison made of mist and memory, now appeared plain and silent under a pale, indifferent sky. No movement, no watchers, just gray rock, muted waves, and a faint wind brushing the shore. And then he saw it, his yacht, gently rocking in calm water beyond the reef, perfectly intact. He walked toward it without urgency. His body moved steadily, without fatigue or hesitation. The sand gave easily under his feet, the sea breeze now cool against his face. When he reached the boat, he climbed aboard, like a man returning to a room he had only just left. Nothing had changed. The equipment blinked to life without delay. The engine turned over smoothly. The GPS, now functioning, displayed coordinates that placed him nowhere. According to the map, this part of the ocean didn't exist. No island, no tower, no record of any landmass within 100 nautical miles. He didn't question it. He didn't try to look back. He simply pointed the bow west, toward the mainland, and started moving. 3 days later, a passing freighter picked up his signal. The captain, surprised to see a solo sailor in restricted waters, helped him aboard and offered medical checks. He was fine, no injuries, slight dehydration, but otherwise healthy. What puzzled them most was the state of the yacht's logs. The digital records showed missing time. Nearly 22 hours had been overwritten, erased. No GPS track, no engine activity, no sign of storms or signal blackouts, just a blank stretch of nothing. When he told them about the lighthouse, about the island, about the voice on the radio, they listened politely, then gently changed the subject. One of the younger crew members told him, almost in a whisper, that people sometimes came back from the Atlantic with stories like that. Not many, but enough. Once ashore, the Coast Guard asked questions. He gave answers. They pulled out naval charts, sonar records, old survey maps. He pointed to the spot where the island had been. They told him that region had never held land. Not now, not ever. The logs were filed, the yacht impounded for inspection. He was released without incident. As far as they were concerned, it was just another case of maritime confusion, fog, fatigue, disorientation, nothing new. He returned home to a city that had continued without him. He tried to rebuild a routine, shopping, working, sleeping, but there was always something just outside his reach. Conversations felt too shallow, lights too bright. He avoided screens, mirrors, anything reflective. The ocean appeared in his dreams more than the city ever did. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the clouds hung low, he would step out onto his balcony and catch a flicker of white light in the distance. It moved with a steady, deliberate rhythm. It didn't blink. It didn't call to him. It simply turned, just as it always had. And somewhere in the corner of his mind, he knew it was still there, waiting.